When George Hamilton dated Lynda Bird Johnson, the daughter of President Lyndon B. Johnson, the White House didn't merely object. The president ordered the FBI to dig into his private life. Overnight, a young actor who had once walked red carpets suddenly found himself dragged into the dark zone of power. Files, investigations, rumors, and suffocating, scrutinizing stares. This was no longer a Hollywood love story. It was the moment fame could turn into a trap, with a single phone call from the most powerful place in America. But George Hamilton was the kind of man who, the more he was cornered, the more he knew how to survive. He rose too fast, winning a Golden Globe for his debut role, praised as a formidable new face of his generation. Hollywood lifted him up as the perfect heartthrob, then immediately bound him to that very image, locking him into the role of the charming playboy and forcing him to live forever inside that glossy suit. On the outside was the polished smile and the signature sun-kissed skin. But on the inside were years of struggle to reclaim control of his own fate, unexpected rebirths through comedy, dangerous lines drawn between money and scandal, and repeated moments when he stood on the edge of being erased from the game altogether. George Hamilton is the story of a man with real talent, but one who paid a brutal price to keep from being swallowed whole by his own spotlight. That feeling of being watched like a dangerous subject, of being turned into an investigative target simply for stepping into the orbit of power, didn't appear out of nowhere in George Hamilton's life. It was almost like an adult version of something he had tasted very early. A childhood constantly knocked off balance, where everything could change direction after a single shock, and a child forced to learn how to adapt just to avoid being swallowed whole. George Hamilton was born on August 12, 1939, in Memphis, Tennessee. His father, George William "Spike" Hamilton, was a conductor and band leader who frequently took his orchestra on tour. His mother, Annie Lucille Stevens, was Southern-born, sharp, poised, and socially sophisticated. Because of that, George's earliest childhood carried a kind of glamour, Hollywood style, hotels, constant travel, grown-up conversations, party lights, and the feeling that he was living in a world that knew how to make everything look beautiful. But that outer shell was brutally thin. In 1944, his parents' marriage collapsed after his father had an affair with a singer in the band. George was only about 5 years old. That rupture triggered a visible freefall from a life of movement wrapped in musical shine to a reality where a mother had to carry 3 young sons and search for somewhere to survive. They moved to Blytheville, Arkansas, living with his maternal grandparents, a rare stretch when George felt the world finally stand still, warm, and safe. He grew close to them, absorbing the Southern code, politeness, softness, knowing when to smile, instincts that would later become his survival tools on the red carpet. Then came the shock in 1947, when both grandparents died one after the other. The last foundation disappeared, leaving his mother alone with the weight of survival and 3 children. In that moment, she made a reckless decision, one that years later would still be repeated like a fateful detail. She flipped a coin to choose between New York and Hollywood. The coin landed on Hollywood, and the family left for California immediately, as if every hope they had was being wagered on a single direction. From there, George's life entered a long stretch of instability. His mother remarried several times, leading to constant moves from city to city: Beverly Hills, Boston, New York, Palm Beach. Each relocation meant the child had to start over, a new school, new friends, new rules. George passed through private schools, boarding schools, and even a military environment. That endless cycle of change forced him to develop an unusual skill early on, watching people closely so he could blend in instantly, using calmness and charm like a suit of armor. Years later, standing inside Hollywood's traps, people would notice how he always looked polished, courteous, steady, almost never panicked. That wasn't random. It was the product of a childhood that had required him again and again to stand tall in the middle of chaos. The years of being thrown from one move to another, from one school to the next, and living with the feeling that nowhere is truly home, left George Hamilton with a very specific reflex. If you want to survive, you have to create a version of yourself that deserves to be seen. He didn't enter film through formal training or a protected family background. He entered the business with the only weapon he had been sharpening throughout his teenage years: the ability to stand tall, stay composed, and make people believe he belonged there, while inside, the cracks of a child raised in instability were still fully intact. In 1957, George returned to Hollywood with a goal so clear it was almost reckless: to become an actor. Hollywood at the time was overflowing with handsome faces, full of perfect young men crushed simply because there was no role for them. George understood the rules far better than his innocent appearance suggested. To be chosen, you first had to become. Impossible to ignore. He took small parts, showed up on television, endured the kind of patience only someone truly starving for opportunity could understand. A hunger not only for money, but for recognition. Every time he stood in front of a camera, he asked himself the same question. Would he be dismissed as a harmless pretty boy, or could he become an actor capable of far more? In 1958, he began taking his first meaningful steps in television, most notably In the Veil, a strange and troubled series whose production issues almost buried it alive, yet which later gained an oddly magnetic reputation among film lovers. The kind of lost work that becomes even more sought after precisely because it was missed. For George, what mattered wasn't whether the show aired loudly or quietly. What mattered was the feeling of being allowed, for the first time, to step into stories that were heavier in atmosphere, mysterious, sharp-edged, darker than his own polished image. It was like a small door cracking open. If he found the right rhythm, he might actually escape the trap of his looks. That door truly burst open in 1959 with Crime and Punishment USA. George was placed in the role of Robert Cole, a law student who commits murder and then collapses into guilt, trembling between the pursuit of his conscience and the tightening net of investigation. This was no longer the kind of role where you're handsome so people can stare at you. The part forced him to do something harder. Let the audience see the fracture inside, feel the real fear of a human being. The bitter irony was that the moment he finally touched that depth, Hollywood began looking at him through a new lens. Comparisons to Anthony Perkins surfaced like a shadow hanging above his head. The physical resemblance helped him get noticed, but at the same time, it turned him into a potential copy in the eyes of a system addicted to packaging. George was pushed into an impossible dilemma: use the comparison to get hired, or resist it to be recognized as himself. A psychological fight every young actor entering the studio machine has to face, except not everyone is clear-eyed enough to realize it. That performance delivered the kind of breakthrough many actors dream of their entire lives and never reach. He won the Golden Globe for New Star of the Year, actor awarded in 1960 for the achievements of the 1959 film, and he was also nominated for the BAFTA Award for Best Foreign Actor. It felt like a golden ticket, but in Hollywood, every golden ticket has a dark reverse side. It doesn't just open doors, it also pins a label to your chest. From that moment on, George walked down the street no longer as a young man searching for roles. He became the promising newcomer, a product with expectations attached. And expectation always breeds fear. Fear of slipping, fear of being replaced, fear that one failed film would instantly turn all praise into a joke. That is the psychological cost of being famous too early. You haven't even matured yet, and you're already forced to act as if you're invincible. In 1960, Home from the Hill arrived like a higher-level test. Under director Vincente Minnelli, the film would not allow George to survive on his eyes or his posture. It forced him to stand inside a world of family fracture, expectations heavy as stone, suffocating father-son conflict, an environment where simply being handsome would get you killed. This was the kind of role that demanded restraint, acting through silence, through hesitation, through the feeling of being trapped between wanting to be loved and fearing you will never be good enough. If Crime and Punishment USA gave George the key to fame, Home from the Hill proved he could carry the weight of serious storytelling. And as audiences began looking at him differently, George learned a colder truth. The road ahead wouldn't be only upward. It would be a long fight to win back the right to choose roles as an actor rather than being chosen as a face. Winning too early often feels like a congratulations wrapped inside a warning. When George Hamilton walked out of Home from the Hill, he was no longer just a promising newcomer. He became a face Hollywood wanted to own. And when Hollywood wants to own someone, it always begins the same way. They don't ask what that person wants to become. They decide for them. In 1960, where the boys are exploded like a mass-market turning point, George wasn't just seen, he was launched as a symbol. Ryder Smith carried exactly what America at the start of the 1960s was hungry for. Handsome, polite, slightly distant, carrying the aura of someone who belonged to the upper world, yet still seductive enough to become the dream of young girls. The film wasn't simply a hit. It created a cultural effect. The image of college students flooding into Florida for spring break slowly became a tradition, then a craze, then something people would later cite as a generational landmark. Among the scenes audiences never forgot, there was a moment that seemed feather-light, yet functioned like a star's signature. A question mark drawn in the sand, a playful blink of the film, but the kind of detail the media clung to, fans clung to, and that stamped the character's name into the crowd's memory. George understood it quickly. In Hollywood, sometimes you don't need a line to become legendary. You only need an image. But that very success began building the golden cage. George became a heartthrob, the polished gentleman women desired and men quietly measured themselves against. The studios loved that image because it was easy to sell. The problem is, what sells well is usually manufactured by a template. The same kind of look, the same kind of part, the same unspoken promise. Just stay handsome, stay charming, stay safe. Don't do anything that makes the audience uncomfortable. That was the moment his career began to feel suffocating. The brighter the spotlight, the narrower the hallway of roles. George reacted by doing something harder, proving he wasn't just a beautiful photograph that could walk. In 1962, Light in the Piazza arrived like a serious test. His Fabrizio was gentle, patient, quietly refined, a man who loved through sincerity, not playboy performance. The film didn't explode at the box office, but it gave George something he needed more than ticket money. Recognition that he could act, could hold emotional rhythm, could stand inside a complicated story without being swallowed by his looks. But that recognition still wasn't strong enough to break the label Hollywood had pasted onto his forehead. People still called him the charming playboy. Scripts still landed in the same direction. The more he tried to escape, the more he felt like he was pushing against a door locked from the outside. By the mid to late 1960s, what hurt George wasn't being hated, but being loved in a lazy way. The public loved his image. The studios loved what that image could sell. Only George began to hate the feeling of being trapped inside the same suit, worn so long that even he no longer knew what was left underneath. And from that point, a slow-burning need formed. If the industry insisted on forcing him into the handsome and charming mold, he would learn to rewrite that mold with his own hands, not only through roles, but through strategy. The turning point came in the early 1970s in a quiet but dangerous way. George began doing what many young leading men never dared to do, seizing control. In 1971, he became involved in producing Evel Knievel, a project about the legendary stunt performer. This wasn't the kind of film where George could showcase a smile or gentlemanly posture. This was the choice of someone tired of waiting by the phone. He stepped deeper into the machinery of Hollywood itself. Where the money comes from, where the power sits, who decides whether a project lives or dies. Once you understand the rules, you're no longer an actor standing outside the door. You become someone who knows how to go around the building when the front entrance is locked. The early to mid-1970s therefore felt like a compressed, high-tension stage. The fame was still there, but the excitement had dried up. The looks were still an advantage, but also the very advantage that made people doubt him. He had to maintain the image to avoid being discarded, while also finding an escape route so he wouldn't drown inside that image. That contradiction shaped a very specific kind of endurance in George Hamilton. Calculated endurance. Endurance built for the moment of the turn. And that moment ignited in 1979 with Love at First Bite. It was a market reset, a rebirth by design. George chose Dracula, but not the classic Gothic Dracula. He turned Dracula into a disco-era aristocrat. Elegant, just ridiculous enough, self-mocking in exactly the right measure, fully aware he was being watched, and turning that gaze into laughter. The smartest part was this. The very thing that had been mocked, his trademark tan, became the comedic blade. Dracula, who's tanned? That absurd contradiction made the audience laugh first, and only then realize George Hamilton wasn't just playing a role, he was playing his entire life on screen. A man brave enough to use the image that had typecast him as the weapon to smash the mold. And it won big. Roughly $43.9 million in box office against a budget of around $3 million, a ratio that made Hollywood sit up straight. That success wasn't just money, it was a message delivered directly into the system. George Hamilton wasn't a fading pretty boy, clawing for relevance. He was someone who knew how to turn himself into a new product at exactly the right time. That hit also brought him a Golden Globe nomination in the musical comedy category as a stamp of confirmation. He could make crowds laugh, and if you can make them laugh, you can survive. In 1981, he pushed an even riskier bet with Zorro the Gay Blade. George didn't just play one Zorro, he played two, Don Diego and the flamboyant twin Bunny. It was the kind of choice that could easily provoke controversy, easily be labeled too much, easily become ridicule. Yet George aimed straight at the weakness and turned it into strength. I'm not afraid to be the joke, because I'm the one, controlling it. The film divided reactions. Some called it bold, others called it excessive, but professionally, it was a declaration. He was willing to break the mold to the end, willing to use his old, polished gentleman image as raw material, to bend it, tease it, laugh in the face of the golden cage that had locked him in for a decade. And more importantly, the performance earned him another Golden Globe nomination, reinforcing the new position he had carved out. George Hamilton was no longer merely a face trapped by typecasting. He was a man capable of flipping the game through intelligence, self-awareness, and a frightening survival instinct. From there, his career entered a different chapter. Because once you've proven you can make an audience laugh and shake the box office, Hollywood no longer has the right to call you handsome for decoration. George Hamilton pushed himself out of the trap of typecasting with a strike that was both gentle and ruthless. He turned the prejudice against him into the very thing that delivered victory. George Hamilton's comedic rebirth may have reset his value in Hollywood, but his fame had exploded much earlier, not because of a role, but because of a love story that kept America awake at night. George Hamilton and Lynda Bird Johnson, the daughter of President Lyndon B. Johnson. It was the kind of romance where a single public appearance together could become front-page news, because between them there wasn't only emotion, there was the White House. They met through the power entertainment networks in Washington in rooms where parties weren't just about wine and music, but also about eyes that read you. Lynda wasn't a Hollywood girl. She carried the quiet restraint of someone trained to hold emotion back, to speak just enough, smile just enough. And that very guardedness created a strange pull for George, a man living in a world of glare and glamour, yet constantly craving something that felt real. The relationship moved fast, and in no time they became a shocking couple, a film star walking beside the president's daughter as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The media followed their every step. They appeared at major events, Oscars, galas, high society trips wrapped in the aura of political privilege. When George went to the LBJ Ranch for Easter, it was no longer a boyfriend's introduction. It felt like a test of nerve. To the public, the story read like a romance novel. To President Johnson, it looked like a risk of security, of dignity, of family reputation. What made the story suffocating was that Johnson didn't merely object. He called the FBI, not a polite check. A real investigation. Who were George's friends? What was his private life like? Was there anything that could be exploited? Anything that could be used as leverage? Rumors included, the kind that could destroy a career within hours. George was shoved into a position both absurd and brutal. A charming playboy once used to being pursued, now became a man forced to prove he wasn't an opportunist. Love turned into a tightrope walk, where every step could drop straight into the abyss. One scene is often repeated as a manhood moment, a hunting trip at the Texas ranch when Johnson handed George a gun. It wasn't a family-friendly gesture. It felt like a wordless message. In here, I set the rules. George understood it. He was always good at reading the air. He took the gun, kept his composure, performed man enough, calm enough not to make anything explode at the table of power. Even if he passed that gate, the relationship was still strangled day by invisible surveillance. They never made it to marriage, not because they weren't attached, but because this was the kind of love surrounded by too many hands. By late 1966, they split. The strange part is that George wasn't thrown out of that world with bitterness. In 1967, when Lynda married Charles Robb, George even showed up, smiling, posing for photos, holding himself like a gentleman. A sight that sends a chill down the spine. The love had ended, yet the man stood there as if he had never hurt, like someone who had become too skilled at swallowing his emotions whole. The Lynda Bird Johnson chapter taught George Hamilton a cold lesson. When fame touches power, love can be turned into a file. He escaped the White House without being torn apart in the press, kept the gentleman's posture, kept the smile for the cameras. But that very survival skill quietly created a dangerous illusion. George began to believe that as long as he was polished enough, clever enough, proper enough. He could pass through any corridor of power without being wounded. Then 1979 happened. Love at first bite exploded, returning him to the kind of status where people had to invite him back to the big table. And at that exact moment, another door opened. This time, not a red carpet door, but Manila. George traveled to the Philippines to promote the film. One lunchtime invitation brought him to the presidential palace to meet Imelda Marcos, the first lady famous for glamour, for art obsession, for collecting symbols the world could not ignore. To Imelda, George Hamilton wasn't just an actor. He was human jewelry, elegant, Western, famous, the perfect kind of luxury to place beside power. To George, that lunch looked like a golden opportunity, being lifted up by someone standing at the center of Asian power, treated like an honored guest, granted access to a world even Hollywood had to respect. That warmth quickly attracted certain names around him, people who never stepped into the spotlight yet decided where money flowed. Antonio Florendo, a wealthy businessman linked to power networks in the Philippines. Glyceria Gigi Tantoco, a woman widely viewed as an insider close to Imelda, appearing in connections that courts and journalists would later call by their terrifying real name, a network. On the surface, everything remained pure glamour. Parties, film festivals, trips packaged as cultural exchange. The submerged part was what turned George's life into something darker. Money began moving through his accounts. A loan of $600,000 from Antonio Florendo was often mentioned, small on paper, but enough to make the story ignite into suspicion. George explained it the way a gentleman would: a loan to manage assets, to invest, to stabilize a project. The problem was that timing and context made every explanation thin as paper. When a Hollywood actor grew close to Imelda Marcos and accepted money from a businessman within the Marcos orbit, the public no longer saw it as borrowing. They saw it as a backdoor, power, trying to push money through a clean image. From 1982 onward, the suspicions swelled. The money no longer sounded like a loan. There were milestones that felt chilling in the investigative chain. George's accounts were said to have seen millions pass through. The most striking detail was a Hong Kong bank, an alleged transit point that immediately made the story smell like money laundering. One number kept cutting like a blade: $5.5 million. Trips, transfers, withdrawals, enough. For people to ask, what legitimate reason could an actor, even a famous one, have to move money like that in a period when the Marcoses were accused of stealing from the national treasury? And once money casts a shadow, everything around you changes color. Renovations, asset changes, investments. All of it suddenly became pieces held under a microscope. There was even talk of a film project tied to Douglas MacArthur, an idea diverted, a script distorted, funding disappearing into fog. Under the surface of making a film, people heard a different sound, money being legitimized through an artistic story. George Hamilton fell into a uniquely toxic position. He wasn't a politician, so he couldn't hide behind the cynical excuse that everyone is dirty. He wasn't a tycoon, so people couldn't assume his money came from dozens of legal channels. He was an actor, a symbol of polished grace, someone the public wanted to believe was clean. That was exactly why even a single stain could rip his image open. By the late 1980s, his name began appearing in files in the way any star fears most: named as a co-conspirator. At times, he was attached to lists of co-conspirators. Other times, he was described as unindicted, not prosecuted, yet still pulled into the story as a possible link. The killer wasn't a sentence. The killer was the label, suspected. named alongside Marcos, placed next to numbers and Hong Kong banks, reduced to the famous man whose image power could send money through. One verification point made it impossible to dismiss as gossip. The Los Angeles Times reported information linked to 1990 testimony, mentioning Hamilton receiving a $600,000 loan from Antonio Florendo, along with disputes over documents and files and litigation. The fact that a paper of that scale recorded his name in the Marcos narrative was enough to freeze the sense of innocence he worked so hard to maintain. George continued to deny wrongdoing, continued to insist it was only friendship, only social relations. That answer sounds reasonable, until you remember that power never gives money to someone merely to be friends. The money passed through his accounts. His fame became a soft stamp of legitimacy, and the Hollywood gentleman image carried from that point forward a scratch that could never be fully polished away. The scratch of a star who once believed he could step into the world of power without being pulled down by it. The Marcos stain didn't steal George Hamilton's politeness, but it forced him to face a cold truth. Hollywood can forgive a scandal, so long as you know how to turn it into value. When the gentleman image was dragged into the gray zone of money, George didn't choose to complain or defend himself with moral speeches. He did something more practical, more ruthless. He turned himself into a sellable brand, so his fame would no longer be fragile, no longer dependent on films alone. He grabbed the one thing the public remembered most, the very trait that had been mocked for years: his tan. George didn't fight the laughter. He embraced it, compressed it into profit. Who else takes what people ridicule and turns it into an assembly line of money? By the late 1980s, the tan was no longer a tabloid punchline. It became an ecosystem. The George Hamilton skincare system, sun care system. A full lineup was packaged as the secret formula of the golden tanned gentleman, exfoliating scrubs, masks, overnight gels promising recovery and healthy radiance by morning. At first, it was sold through mail order, hitting the American instinct directly, buying a star-signed product as if you were buying a piece of their glow. Once sales grew strong enough, the line moved into department stores. Real shelves, real counters, a sense of legitimacy. One version of the story even mentions a number that makes people pause. Over $4 million in the first year. Nobody had to love George. As long as they wanted what he represented, an appearance that looked like it had just returned from a luxurious vacation, they would still reach for their wallets. The real gamble came next. Once the product was selling, George opened tanning salons, right when society was beginning to panic about skin cancer. People started avoiding the sun. Doctors warned. Newspapers ran headlines about risk. George moved in the opposite direction. He didn't abandon the image to play it safe. He expanded it into a business model, selling artificial sunlight, selling the shortcut ticket to the look the world had attached to his name for decades. This was the contradiction of his career in its purest form. He was making money from the image, yet that very image began striking back. The tanning salons invited controversy. They brought lawsuits and settlements. The cruelest part was how the circle closed on his own body. After years of placing skin on a throne, George eventually had to face removals, cutting away damaged areas. A man who built an empire around the tan ended up paying for it with the very thing that had lifted him. By 1997, he pivoted again, choosing a new way to keep his glow alive with even more theatrical flair. Hamilton's Cigar Lounge at the New York Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. George didn't simply open a venue, he built a new stage for himself. The lounge had private rooms styled like train cars, including one called the Club Car. The cigar menu featured 15 blends bearing the Hamilton name. some even titled like movie roles. King George, Zorro. He sold cigars the way he had always sold himself, not by selling an object, but by selling a lifestyle. For a time, it became a gathering spot for that old-school luxury Vegas loves. And when the cigar bar wave cooled and competition rose, the lounge shut down, and George stepped away neatly like an actor leaving the stage before the audience could see the makeup crack. George Hamilton could turn almost everything in his life into a show, from his tan to his lifestyle, but when he met Alana Stewart, everything suddenly felt unscripted. Alana arrived at the exact moment he was being stamped as a playboy, handsome, famous, living under lights and rumors, making the public see this relationship as a performance that would eventually end in scandal. But Alana didn't enter his life as a shiny accessory. She entered it as a woman strong enough to see through the surface polish, to touch the real part beneath the smile. The part even Hollywood only dared to guess at, but never truly held. They met and were pulled toward each other quickly and intensely, like two people who had both lived too long in a world full of misunderstood stares. George was a man trained to hide everything behind a smile, to use politeness as an escape route whenever things got uncomfortable. Alana carried a different kind of softness, the kind of woman who understood show business but refused to be swallowed by it. Their marriage came in a way that was pure George Hamilton, impulsive, cinematic, almost reckless. In 1972, in Las Vegas. No months-long plan, no carefully PR'd wedding photos. Standing beside them as witness that day was Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis Presley's manager. And either before or after signing the papers, George still managed to wander into the casino and lose a not small amount at the roulette table. He married by emotion and lost money by habit. Romantic and reckless at the same time, perfectly fitting a man who always lived as if he were performing. Marriage with Alana wasn't a quiet paradise. It was the real life of two young people at the center of a storm. Schedules, invitations, parties, powerful friend lists, non-stop travel, attention that never shut off. George was the kind of man who, when loved, could shine, and when losing something went silent. He was used to turning everything into a joke, even the things that hurt. Alana couldn't live forever as the woman standing behind her husband's smile. She wanted a family, a sense of belonging, a man who was home more than he was on red carpets. Conflict didn't need screaming. It grew out of silent exhaustion, one person always facing outward, the other needing to pull inward. In 1974, their son was born, Ashley Hamilton. That moment forced George to face, for the first time, a truth that's hard to swallow for a man addicted to spotlight. Being a father is not the same as playing a father. His love for his child was real, but a star's life made presence a luxury. There were times George still had to leave for work, still had to rush from sets back to family, still found himself torn between responsibility and the habit of chasing lights, a kind of struggle no acting school ever teaches. Alana saw it more clearly than anyone because she was the one who stayed with the child, who stayed with the house after the flashbulbs went dark. They divorced in 1976, so quickly that the world concluded it was just another marriage made for the papers. The truth was far more complicated. They ended their roles as husband and wife, but they did not end their bond. The strange part was this: what kept them connected wasn't obligation, and it wasn't fear of loneliness. It was something harder to name. They understood each other too well to become enemies. People are used to seeing divorce as war. George and Alana turned it into a different kind of life together. Lighter, more practical, less expectation-driven, yet somehow more enduring. Ashley grew up between two people who were no longer married, yet still remained a team. George continued to appear as a father who knew how to make up for absence through the right kind of presence, who knew how to catch his son with humor when the boy drifted off the rails. Ashley later entered entertainment, carrying both the privilege and the pressure of a famous last name. And when Ashley went through unstable, darker periods, George and Alana revealed who they truly were: imperfect, quiet, but refusing to leave their son alone in the dark. As time passed, that bond didn't die. It transformed into something the public never expected. By the mid-1990s, they even appeared together, hosted together, as if all of Hollywood had to stare in disbelief. Two people divorced for years, yet still able to laugh together as naturally as this. It was no longer about romance. It was the kind of connection that can only form when two people have seen the worst in each other and still can't bring themselves to wipe it clean. Shared meals, frequent phone calls. Alana becoming the one who pulls George back to reality when he gets lost in ego, artistry, and luxury. All of it formed a family structure that was unusual, but solid. The difference is this: many stars after divorce fade from the stage like faces that have run out of time. But George Hamilton didn't. He understood one brutal truth about show business: audiences may forget your films, but they don't forget a face. If that face knows how to reappear in the right place, at the right time. And when cinema was no longer the only runway, he pivoted to mass television. This new screen that keeps fame alive through closeness, curiosity, and fast entertainment. In 2006, George entered Dancing with the Stars, Season 2, at an age when many actors would have chosen to rest. He didn't jump into the competition with technique or a hunger to win. He entered with what he knew best: stage nerve. Viewers saw a Hollywood gentleman step onto the dance floor without fear of looking ridiculous, without fear of looking old. The performance people remember most was the Zorro-inspired routine: mask on, sword in hand, the spirit both humorous and proud, as if he were reminding everyone, an image is only powerful when you're confident enough to play with it. He became a fan favorite, made it to week 6, then exited. But what he gained was bigger than any title. He reclaimed his right to appear before the public in a completely new way: lighter, closer, more entertaining. 3 years later, in 2009, he chose an even more upside-down stage. I'm a Celebrity. Get Me Out of Here, UK. A polished gentleman, accustomed to suits and spotlights, stepped into the Australian jungle, where there is no makeup, no flattering set design, only challenges and endurance. George didn't try to prove he was great. He proved he was adaptable. He joined as someone who understood the rules of television. Audiences don't need you to be perfect. They need you to have personality. And he left the game in a very George Hamilton way. No noise, no drama, simply choosing to withdraw himself, like a quiet declaration that he entered for the experience, not to beg for a few more scraps of spotlight. By 2015, Stewart's and Hamilton's, E, brought him and Alana back in a format that let the public see up close. Family life, daily rhythm, the strange closeness after divorce, the half-joking, half-honest dialogue between two people who once loved each other too deeply to become strangers. Here, George wasn't playing Dracula or Zorro anymore. He was playing himself. An aging gentleman, still sharp, still funny, able to soften any moment with quiet charm. Reality television wasn't just TV. It was his way of pulling the classic gentleman image into modern life, so a new generation could understand that George Hamilton was not a name sleeping inside an old VHS tape. In the same rhythm, in 2016, he appeared in a cameo on the sitcom Two Broke Girls, a small touch but extremely smart. George understood. You don't need a big role. You just need the right show, the right audience, the right timing, and the name will spark again like a reminder. Every cameo was a way of sliding his brand into pop culture without begging Hollywood for permission. And once television had built the bridge across generations, George delivered his strongest strike, not through film, but through advertising. In 2016, KFC launched its constantly changing actor campaign for Colonel Sanders. This was the kind of stage many actors would call beneath them. George saw it as opportunity. Commercials are where a star can be resurrected in seconds if he's clever enough to turn himself into the right kind of joke at the right moment. He took the role of the extra crispy colonel without embarrassment. White suit on, that legendary tan as a deliberate punchline, turning his own brand into comedy. The brilliance was this: he didn't take the role to be remembered. He sold himself as a complete entertainment product, able to mock the sun damage people had always teased him about, turning memes into money and laughter into reach. In 2018, he returned for another round. Like confirmation, this wasn't accidental. George Hamilton had achieved what many stars fear most, stepping into the internet era without being swallowed by it, but instead turning himself into an updated version of himself. Still the gentleman, still the smile, still the legendary tan. Except this time, he used the very things people once mocked to control the game. Across his career, George Hamilton didn't simply exist as a handsome face of Hollywood. He became something rarer, a brand, a man who knew how to turn image into power. He entered cinema with a real explosion, winning the Golden Globe for New Star of the Year. Actor, and earning a BAFTA nomination, then left his mark on pop culture with roles that were seductive yet self-aware. Especially the box office hit Love at First Bite, which brought him another Golden Globe nomination and made him the unforgettable symbol of disco-era Dracula. When Hollywood changed, he wasn't left behind. Mass television, reality shows, sitcom cameos, even KFC commercials, everything became a stage where he could reposition himself as a figure a new generation could recognize within seconds of appearing. George Hamilton used glamour to mask the cold laws of the industry, but that same clarity is what allowed him to survive. A man once typecast, once surrounded by suspicion and rumor, who never allowed himself to drift away like a washed-up star. He didn't win by being universally adored. He won through a rare skill, the ability to turn every era into his stage. What impresses you most about George Hamilton? His ability to survive as a brand, his incredibly smart career pivots, or the way he turned himself into an irreplaceable icon? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep exploring lives that seem to be all glory on the surface. But the deeper you look, the more cracks you find that nobody ever tells.